guys, so today I just wanted to go over how I like to drive my interviews. And this is from like the interviewee perspective, not the interviewer. A problem I had a lot when I was younger mostly was I would go into an interview and just kind of sit there and like react to what the interviewer was saying. And I didn't really have like a plan of action when I was going in. And over the years, even though I'm not really that old yet, um, I've kind of refined my, I guess, strategy for going into interviews. So instead of just going in and sitting there, like making small talk and then like waiting, which I feel like a lot of people do, I've started going in and, having a certain set of things that I always do. These are for technical interviews. So normally what happens in technical interviews is the interviewer will give you your question that you have to solve and they'll give you time to read it. And then that's pretty much everything they'll give you. Everything else you kind of have to ask for or figure out on your own. So what I tend to go for is I'll read the question out loud, and then for every scenario or every piece of information I get, I write it down, and then I'll go over, I guess, my first thought of how to solve the problem. Like, oh, maybe I feel like, my gut is telling me maybe try a hash map. So I'll say, like, oh, I feel like a hash map would work really well. I'll probably revisit this later. And like every minute, like there's not a single moment where I'm not talking. The only time I wouldn't be talking is if I'm asking them a question. So if I'm like, oh, it says here, we're given an array of numbers. Should that mean decimal? Should that mean float? Should that mean integer? Or, questions like that. That's the only time that I'm kind of waiting. Or if I'm like, oh, this part kind of threw me for a loop. Give me a minute to think about it. But other than that, I'm pretty much talking all the time. And it's just like my whole thought process. I'm like, oh, given this, we have an array of this. I'm thinking maybe like, oh, okay, so like this is something I'll actually like do. I'll be like, oh, if I use a hash map, then I could do it like this. If I use an array, I could do it like this. And like, since we're working with arrays, probably I'll have to see every single element. So like best case scenario, it'll have to be O of n complexity and like which data structures are like O of n, and like when I'm piecing it together in my head, I'll also be saying it out loud. So it's not like I'm quiet for like 5 minutes and I'm like, oh, the answer is hash map with da da da. Like that way they can kind of see your whole process. And I find that that really works for me. And it's better also because if I do get stuck, since I've been, verbalizing it, they're following along with me. They're not like, oh, on their phone while I'm thinking and then I'm like, oh, I'm stuck. In that moment, they can just be like, oh, well, you mentioned this earlier. Maybe you can think about it in a different way. And I find that's really helpful. But yeah, to be specific, the first thing I would do is read the problem and kind of distill out the important information. And then the second thing I would do is ask clarifying questions. The third thing would be to state what I think is like the brute force solution, and then also state the time and space complexity of that solution, and then ask the interviewer if they want me to code it. Most of the time they'll say no, and then that'll kind of set a baseline to be like, oh, I understand the problem at like the minimum level. And then after that, I kind of have to come up with a more efficient solution either in time or space complexity. So I'll go over techniques on like how to, process all that later. But then, assuming I get that far, I have ways to make the problem more efficient or the solution more efficient. Yeah, so I have ways to make the solution more efficient. And then I'll kind of go over that with the interviewer, like, oh, if I use this building on top of my previous solution, then that changes the time complexity to be this, changes the space complexity to be this. Let me think of a way to make it even more efficient. And then you kind of keep going in this like loop of like, oh, I'll fix this a little bit, maybe this technique, this other thing. And then at some point, this whole thing should only take like 2-3 minutes. And then at some point they'll be like, oh, I think we can start coding now. Or there'll be like an awkward pause, and then you'll be like, should I start coding this? And then they'll say yes. So then that's when you start coding. So after the first like couple minutes, you should start coding. But when I say coding, I mean like do a little bit of pseudo, like 2 minutes of pseudocoding, and then jump into coding. So yeah, that's all I have for today, guys. I'll definitely go more in depth into little pieces that I talked about in this video. Let me know what you have questions on, and let me know what else I can help you guys with. Bye!